put this in.
Sorry, I forgot
It's
to
all right,
record.
and it hasn't changed. But the first goal is the technical work. And in Ukraine, the Ministry of Education asked our government if we could send people to teach in their schools and help them in the more rural areas get into more critical thinking and more student-focused approaches, a little bit less of the repetition and a little bit more of the engagement. And that's traditionally been what most of our volunteers do, work in more remote high schools and some of the universities all over Ukraine. And that's just those are the things that the young volunteers particularly want on their resumes. They get professional experience at a high level. And that's the first goal of the Peace Corps. The second goal is about relationships. So it's about learning a language, and it's about living with a homestay family, and it's about making friends. And that's the second goal, basically. Put yourself out there and try to figure out how to engage with your colleagues and make friends. The third goal is about bringing it back to the U.S. To encourage a less insular worldview, perhaps. So you kept telling your friends and family about what's going on in Ukraine from your point of view. You're living in a village, likely. Maybe if you're teaching at university, you're in a larger city, but you're having a very unique experience, and let's bring that back to America. So those are the three Peace Corps goals, and that second one is why I think it's the largest program, and will be again at some point, to have those thousands and thousands of Ukrainian teachers, was most of them, but then we started working with youth development, so we worked with youth clubs, and then also worked with municipalities on with mayors and mayors' offices on decentralization, organizational development. So all of those people interacting with Ukrainians, and then now with social media, you can stay in touch daily, and it's just a lot of relationships. And what that means now with the war, we've had about 3,400 volunteers cycle through Ukraine. Coincidentally, it's celebrating 30 years of Peace Corps this year, and there's all sorts of events that are clearly not even on the table now, but the volunteers are in touch with their colleagues, and they know what the needs are in the field in these communities, and they're raising money, and they're doing a great job, and they're getting it to people in Poland. For example, there's a group that's buying flak jackets and first aid kits for these community brigades. My staff didn't have a lot of men, it was mostly women, but the 10 or so men that were professionals are now in these community defense brigades, and they are not soldiers, but they're out there and learning how to make Molotov cocktails and learning how to recognize the different sides of the howitzers, to know if you need to go underground. It's, without melodramatizing a terrible situation, So they're all doing this stuff that the volunteer groups can raise. For example, in a week, one of them raised $40,000 and got a bunch of the flak jackets and first aid kits to people who need them. Rotary is doing an amazing job, from what I heard yesterday, about raising funds. And generally, Rotarians have been extremely responsive to all sorts of crises, war, disasters, and service projects that Barbara was describing. Fantastic. So I don't need to talk to Rotarians about the passion and the value of service. Yesterday, I heard there's a new fund that Rotary Foundation has set up, and maybe that's to what Barbara referred. And funds go directly to Ukraine, and then a Rotary Club district would have to apply for it, 50,000 or 25,000, and these are in Ukraine or on the border of Ukraine. So that's happening now, and they're already, I think she's the woman who we're speaking, they said they were fast tracking the Ukrainian application. So anyway, the collaboration with Rotary and Peace Corps, there's an international memorandum of understanding. And since we did have Rotary clubs in Ukraine, we were working on Rotary leadership academies. Over the last couple of years, they were remote. We had one in-person event with kids from all over, and with your all generous donations, sent a bunch of these people to Ukraine for these great in-person youth development events. We have a woman that was really interested in Rotary, and she got a Rotary scholarship, and she's getting a master's in Scotland now, I guess Edinburgh. So I mean, Rotary's been a great part of the Peace Corps, and that's why it's such a nice fit. There's also a bit of work to get former volunteers into these Rotary clubs about like waiving the an annual payment, whatever that is, at least for the first year. So there's some things nationally that's going on that try to recruit more former volunteers to come and support people who are doing very similar work. And then, so I'll just maybe talk a minute or two, and then there may be questions if there aren't. So I lived in Kyiv for 4 years. Kyiv, not Kiev, and the Ukrainians are very quick, especially now, to not have us in particularly America talk about Kiev. And the dish that I heard of was chicken Kiev growing up, and that's more how it's said in Ruski in Russian. So Kyiv, they have a great I with 2 dots on it, which is like an elongated E, and that's the sound that we're supposed to say Kyiv. But anyway, it's we're all wrong, including the military people. Russia's not going to bomb Kyiv. It would be like bombing Berlin. And like even last night, getting very close to where I live, but certainly there's people who are there. You've probably seen that. I think there's 2 million people left in Kyiv, so half of the population is gone, and there's 6.5 million internally displaced people, and most of my staff who live in the main big cities, moved down to the Romanian border, the Bulgarian border, the Slovakian border, Hungarian border. That's Ukraine's a big country, so down there it's not getting bombed yet. Lviv, which is in the west, is getting bombed, and that's where the safe spot, and that's where the refugees were being pushed through, and some of these supply chains. So that's problematic. But it is something that we thought was, when you measure risk, which is what we did professionally, you measure the severity of the impact, which is enormous, versus the probability of something occurring, which most people that do this for a living said was just unpredictable, but highly, highly unlikely. So this is certainly worst case scenario in all the plan. And without getting into what the U.S. and NATO's response should be, I just throw it out there that there have been no-fly zones in many other circumstances, including Bosnia, not so long ago, and we've done with Israel, we've done with some other countries also. I'll stand up here. Maybe I'll end there, other than saying that the 4 years in Ukraine were very formative for me. I was mentioning to Dory that I realized that I have 2 great-grandmothers that were born in Ukraine. I thought it was Russia, it was Polish Russia, actually in Ukraine. So I am actually made in Ukraine, and I make music also, and I put out an EP, and last one called Made in Ukraine, because I recorded it in Ukraine with musicians, local musicians. And one of the musicians reached out to me yesterday. His name is Max Volsky, and he's also from the same town, coincidentally, coming to Spahilskis in southern Ukraine by Romania, pretty much. And he said, Mike, I took 2 guitars with me. He had a beautiful studio. He had just opened. We just filmed a video, which rolling on to a slow acoustic song called New Beginning. So at some point that'll be appropriate, not now. Anyway, he said, you have another song I can work on remotely. I've got no way to make any money now, and he just got married. Anyway, he's somewhere in Mass where he is. But so we've got another song, and it's a nice little acoustic. So that's probably enough for me. If there are any questions about anything, that would be great. Yes, sir.
Thank you. And thank you for doing what you've done and doing service to the world and to the United States. So my question is, could you help us understand some of the basic differences? Because a lot of the people I know from Ukraine speak Russian as their first language, as an example. Could you help us understand the differences between Ukraine and Russia culturally?
Mm-hmm. I can give you some of my perspectives, certainly not an expert, but I guess what I might say initially is that Ukraine historically has been under the yoke of Russia for a long time, but previously there's something called Kievan Rus. If you go way back to like 1000, it was when the Lithuanian and Polish duchy actually was a huge power, like all the way down to Turkey, and then it receded. But then there were these Slavs that were basically in where Ukraine is now. It didn't even go to Moscow that far east, then up through the Baltics, Belarusia, and that was a big country. But then, you know, the Turks and the Mongol invasion, you know, and then the whole thing with Crimea and the Tartars. It's very convoluted because there's been a lot of people coming in and out. You know, Gorbachev gave Crimea back to Ukraine. It was never really Ukraine's. So, you know, it's very, but then now that's a huge bone of contention. The issue is when Russia or the Soviet Union had control of Ukraine, and just more recently, there was Stalinist collectivization. So there was 3, 4, 8 million Ukrainians who died from hunger, Holodomor in the 30s. They weren't allowed to speak the language. Sent to different camps and the death camps or work camps in the former Soviet Union. And so that's why the Ukrainians are so particular about their language now that they're able to speak it. They want Ukrainians and Russians to speak it. Zelensky, the president, is from a place called Kyiv, kind of Eastish. He speaks Russian much better than Ukrainian, but he's been working on his Ukrainian. Everybody can speak Russian, because unless you're really young, you grew up in school and they taught you Russian. But there's a huge effort, and there's laws that require Ukrainian on TV now. You can't have a Russian. While I was there, you can't have a Russian TV show without Ukrainian subtitles. So situacija, the language situation is very tense. But there's differences in whole, you know, food. You know, if it's a pierogi or vareniki or dumpling, I mean, there's variations on borscht. And food's really important. The real issue, the kicker, and I should start with this, is the Orthodoxy, the church. There's a Russian Orthodox Church, and there's a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church, and Greek Orthodox Church. But Russian and Ukrainian, the Russians wanted the Ukrainians to submit under the, I forgot the name of the, somebody in Constantinople, they still call this place Constantinople, to be under the authority, and the Ukrainian church, absolutely not. So there's a huge amount of tension to what church you belong to, and people that might have very similar values and backgrounds otherwise are fighting. Even women, older women, were fighting about this one issue, and so that's not a complete answer, but those are some of the things that pop to mind with that.
Thank you.
Hi, pre-war, what did a day in the life of a Peace Corps volunteer look like in Ukraine?
If the volunteer was a teacher, if he or she were a teacher, then it would be going to school, and they'd co-teach 18 hours per week with a Ukrainian teacher. So if they prepared beforehand, we asked them to, that was the time, and then grading papers, if people still do that. And then we'd ask them to initiate certain clubs that weren't necessarily part of the Ukrainian Ministry of Education things. So they would do service clubs, often based on their experiences in high school. They would do a lot of English language clubs, a lot of, what's interesting with the newer Peace Corps is about a third is made up of people of color or LGBTQA plus Americans who kind of self-select this experience. So a lot of my job was managing people who were first generation college students, hadn't traveled before, never learned the language, and how does that work in a Ukrainian village? So they would get involved with, we asked them to get involved in community organizations. If there's a lot of, we taught them all how to draft proposals for grant money and to work through that process. We got a lot of money from the U.S. Agency for International Development and from something called PEPFAR to work on HIV and tuberculosis support. So they would try to do things to engage community members. If you worked in youth organization, you work with kids all day and try to train some of the youth workers and some of these positive youth development strategies. So those are some of the things they do. They travel, they get on the train and visit another volunteer and drum up some reason to have a workshop with this person from there. And you know, in Ukraine, travel was so easy until the discount airlines started to come in. You could get a $30 round trip to Vienna, stay in an Airbnb, and still just live life. So. Yes.
I was going to add to what you were saying about the division of the church. So during Soviet Union, there was no, the religious views of practicing religion altogether was prohibited. So everybody was supposed to be more equal, and Russian was very enforced as a language all throughout all the 15 republics. And then when Soviet Union broke up, Ukrainians gained independence, and then the division between the churches became a lot more pronounced. And also historically, I would add that the Western Ukraine is a lot more nationalistic, and there's a big portion of population in Western Ukraine that they're not Orthodox, they're also Catholic, like the Poles.
True.
Yeah.
All true. Thank you.
So that was a good segue to my question. You've worked in so many different countries, so many different areas. How do you get up to speed on history, culture, players who you need to work with in such a way that you can be effective so quickly? Because for me, what you know already would have taken me much longer than 4 years.
Well, thanks. I try to prepare. I was, for example, before I went to Ukraine, I was starting to learn the language. There's something called Duolingo, which Peace Corps staff helped work on the Ukrainian language program during the last evacuation in 2014 when it was Euromaidan. And that's when Ukraine lost Crimea and when Russian-led forces were in the Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk. That was continuing while I was there. So I was learning about the history in my job as I managed security team, but I'm ultimately responsible for where we put volunteers. And we were starting to move them further east because we pulled everyone again in 2014. So we're slowly building the thing back up again. And I was part of assessments that for people in Kherson, which is now besieged, Kyiv, which is now besieged, Mariupol, which we never got in. It was too close to the line. So just out of necessity, I want to know everything. So I'm looking at where Russian troops would come in, Operation Barbarossa in World War II. So probably still use the same ground troops. We talked to the OSCE, different monitoring groups down there, how long would it take the tanks to get to Kherson, which is closest where the heartbeat. So felt the pressure to, especially in a place like Ukraine, to get up to speed as quickly as I could. Tried the language a little bit, read, there's all sorts of documentation. Peace Corps has a good knowledge management system because you can only work for them for 5 years at a time. And you have to get out for at least 5 years and do something else. It's not a career. So, so I work with Peace Corps a lot, but I've also done things with other organizations. Peace Corps doesn't want lifers, someone that does that for their whole. They want people to, I guess, cross-fertilize the pets. So yeah, so my wife's in Myanmar, that's where I was headed, and I can't get in there now. That's why I left Ukraine actually before the war. And so what I was doing was reading all sorts of fiction and nonfiction books about it, and learn some language online. And, yes, just kind of digging in. It's important to come at least with a few on the ground, and I tried to do that. What I've retained from those other dozens of countries, I'm not so sure. Yes.
As a non-military, non-intelligence officer, did this shock you? What took place? Did it seem so predictable?
I wasn't surprised, but heartbroken, maybe. Because there's already a war going on that, for better or worse, people didn't talk about. In Moldova, if you know, there's troops in Transnistria, and in Georgia, watching those two places where Russia-led forces are doing the exact same thing. So, you know, happened in 2008 in Georgia, same thing. This is definitely more brutal. So I think the amount of indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas has been surprising. That's I mean, those are war crimes. So yeah, that's been surprising because you think as a world actor with business ties to the rest of the world, that was the whole point of all of this, is that you're going to lose money, you're destroying the world, you're not going to do it because you need the world to help you make money. And that's not necessarily the case. So surprised, not so much, but just horrified. I thought, this Peace Corps might do military defense analysis on where am I laying, but from what I knew, I thought what was going to happen was, because there's already been in the last couple of years, it was martial law for 30 days, right when I got there in 2018, because the Russian naval officers boarded some Ukrainian naval ships with Russian insignias. It's not Russian light forces, it's the Russian Navy. And they took 10 young men hostage for probably a month and a half. And they closed several ports in Berdyansk and Mariupol, which is destroyed right now. I'm saying it's like Aleppo. They'd already taken that part of the Black Sea. They built a bridge over a town from Kerch. Much information, but the bridge is so low that it doesn't allow a lot of Ukrainian naval ships to get under. So they basically have blocked off that part. So I thought they would take a land bridge down the southern part of Ukraine to connect Crimea to a dam in a place called Novokakhovka, which the Ukrainians used to use to give water to Crimea. But then when Russia took it, they shut off that water source, and Crimea's had a couple of 5 bad drought years. So that operation was what I thought would happen, and they did that, but they also went in 6 or 7 other places. It's
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Вас питання?
What?
Do you speak some Ukrainian?
I speak Russian
Oh, you speak
and I
Russian.
understand Ukrainian. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Since you were living there, what are your thoughts? And Western media doesn't cover it too much, but the president is Jewish, and it's a bit of an oxymoronic thing that he gets the help of some of the battalions that have Nazi convictions
Yeah.
to help him protect against the Russians. What are your thoughts about that?
And when you mentioned the western part of Ukraine, that's what I was thinking
Right.
of. You'll see there's one group called the Azov Battalion, and it's
Correct.
small, and it has no representation in the parliament, the Rada. But it's former fighters that were fighting in the Donbass, and they come back and they're extremely nationalistic to a fault. And that's judgment, I'll say that to a fault. And they're great fighters and they're doing great work now, but they're also they promote Nazi symbolism and anti-Roma, the broad Roma population. They're certainly anti-Jewish, but that's a very small percentage. And again, they have no political representation. That was an issue. They thought they might get 6, 7, 8%, and they got nothing. They got like less than 1% on this election. And Zelensky's Jewish, but I'm not sure he's a practicing Jew, whatever that might be characterized, but he certainly was raised as a Jew, and he's now identifying strongly as a Jew. So that's just more what I might call disinformation. That's the whole reason is to denazify Ukraine, but there's less than 1,000 Nazis that identify as Nazis in the country. There are 43 million.
I think there's a little more than that.
Well, Nazis, I don't know. Again, there's also things like Stephen Bandera, so we've got war heroes who were extremely in the 1800s, 1900s. There were atrocities committed in war, and often the vulnerable populations, such as the Jews and the Roma and the Catholics, get caught in that. So it's just strange bedfellows. I mean, it's the most complicated operating environment that I've worked in. So more complicated now. And again, I don't know the answers to the question.
Does anyone online have questions too? Let's see.
Does the Peace Corps operate in Russia?
Peace Corps operated in Russia until probably 20 some years ago, where Russia decided that it would not renew the visas of the 3 American staff working there, or it was probably about 75 American volunteers. So Russia at one point said yes, in the whole afterglow of Soviet Union falling in 91, so 92, 93. That's when a lot of these countries, Eastern Europe, became part of Peace Corps, which traditionally didn't have functions.
Great. Anyone else?
Yes, I'm wondering if you have any insight as to whether or not any Ukrainian refugees will end up in the United States And if so, how contact might be able to be made to identify where those refugees may settle?
Yes, the United States has authorized TSP, TPS, temporary protected status for Ukrainians who are in the country. I think it's before March 4th, and that may not be the right date, but it's like a week after the war. And that's similar to what we've done with Haiti after the earthquake. It's one of the places that's a real, professional way to say it, a real mess. And Americans done this with, let's see, with Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, Hondurans, some of the drug issues there, the violence. Anyway, that's going to last. So we will get in quite a few, I would say, Ukrainians that isn't part of the regular immigration system, which allows a certain amount of people in based on family ties and that type of thing. So, and there are a lot of church groups that I've seen, in particular religious groups that have been already working to resettle some of these. I have some friends in Minnesota, and they're talking about some families have already come in. So that's a good match. It's freezing. About 10 months of the year, at least. But yeah, so there's going to be quite a bit of, I think, Ukrainian movement into the U.S. The thing is, Kyiv to me was one of the most amazing cities. It's not like it's a better than the U.S. Things are good. Ukraine is an amazing place to be. And those of you who have had the fortunate opportunity to travel there, 15 cities that were just amazing in so many ways. So it's not like Ukrainians want to be here because they've got a great place at some point to go back to. And so, but there will be in the short term, I would guess, quite a bit of it's temporary immigration. Yeah.
All right, last question.
Sure. So I read an article this morning, and let me start with, I don't believe everything I read, but it was some interview with some Ukrainian Air Force pilots who were doing interviews between missions, and they were talking about the successes that they've had against the Russians and the Russian troops. And it's hard to kind of get a handle as I'm reading all the stuff of what the military tactics are, but what counterattacks that they're doing, and if they're really having any impact on what the Russians doing. I know that's probably a lot outside your lane, but you're the closest person I have to ask a question.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. My first thought was that the U.S. is selling a lot of military equipment, has been selling, and now is giving quite a bit. And one piece in particular is called a Javelin, and it's a missile that can actually pierce a tank. And the Obama administration wouldn't sell that because it's offensive. Trump administration did sell it. It's a sale, and they love that. And it's really changed the calculus of the war. No longer can a tank just sit there, and lob shells into these villages, or they can actually take those out. So that's huge, and that's they love it. They certainly love that. There's also, the skill of the Ukrainian Air Force in particular is very high. They, Ukraine, the thing I learned used to be where missiles were built, aircraft concerns there, all under the Soviet Union. They were in Ukraine and Kyiv, Kharkov used to be, was like the universities, one of the centers, famous Moscow. So it's, the population is so educated and so competent. When I say I worked with a very talented team, I wouldn't just say that. So I managed as horizontally as I could, because that's another thing about going in. Like, what's talent look like? In Ukraine, it was over the top, brilliant. Working with them on emotional intelligence, that type of thing. But to answer your question, I think it has a lot to do with just how strong the Ukrainian military is. The U.S. and NATO have been working with Ukraine for at least a dozen years on many training exercises with all this new equipment. So Ukraine's holding out, and you see on the maps by that big, and Russia's this big, and that's not going to last. And they're running out of equipment, and that's why the donations for even to the military for more things are just using up what they have. But they're holding their own, and but also the Russian soldiers apparently are very unskilled, weren't trained, didn't know where they were going, that type of thing. So that doesn't help, I guess, ground. Again, that's out of my lane, yeah, that's the reason why.
Okay, just a quick one. Above and beyond donating money for anything else we can do.
Contact your Congress people, however you feel about it, let them know, and whether it's closed tie or not closed tie. I think it's important to hear that people are interested in what's going on there. And also keep it on the radar. It's been almost a month now, 4 weeks, and I'm looking, it's no longer like the front page of the Sun Right.
Show your age.
Aging myself. So anyway, yeah, just keep it going because I know there's fatigue from all of this. So thank you for that. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Rotarians, for all the services that you do.
That's it.
Michael, we're back up here. Thank you for speaking with us today. We're going to make a contribution to the Rotary Foundation's Polio Plus Fund, which is matched 2-to-1 by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and will provide 30 polio immunizations to children.